Maybe it was the exact details of the equations mentioned. Webb knew those equations well. His doctoral students had been struggling with them for weeks, trying to prove a theory for calculating tension in suspension bridge cables under changing wind conditions. The math required deep knowledge of calculus, physics, material science, and engineering, subjects that took years of education to understand. The idea that a colored child assumed to be uneducated, the daughter of a cleaning woman, could solve what his best students could not was ridiculous on its face. And yet Thomas Hicks had copied the girl's work from the blackboard before erasing it, following knightly procedure. The solution was included with the letter, written carefully in Hicks's block handwriting. Webb checked it that afternoon. He checked it again that night. The next morning he showed it to two colleagues. The proof was correct, more than correct, it was graceful. It used an approach none of them had considered, a way of seeing the problem that made something complex suddenly simple. Whoever had written it understood mathematics beyond calculation. This was true mathematical insight, the rare kind found only in minds that could see the hidden structure behind numbers and forces. The following week, Professor Webb traveled to Boston's South End, carrying a notebook, a pencil, and a skepticism that was already beginning to weaken. Before continuing with what happened when Webb found Lydia Johnson and her mother in their boarding house room, I want to ask you something. If you are drawn to forgotten stories of brilliance that challenge what we believe about who gets to be called a genius, subscribe to this channel and leave a comment about what historical mystery you want explored next. I am building something special here, a community that refuses to let these voices remain unheard. Now let me tell you what Professor Webb discovered in that freezing boarding house and why it would ultimately shatter everything he believed about the human mind. The South End in 1897 was where Boston placed the people it depended on but preferred not to notice. Irish immigrants lived packed into tenements alongside freed slaves and their children. They worked the jobs that kept the city running while living in conditions that kept them unseen. The boarding house where Lydia Johnson lived with her mother, Clara, stood on a narrow street that never received direct sunlight. 4 floors of water-stained brick and broken shutters rose above the sidewalk. The smell of cold smoke and boiled cabbage hung in the stairwell like a permanent haze. Webb climbed to the 3rd floor, his fine coat drawing suspicious looks from residents who recognized the signs of someone from another world. He found the room number Hicks had given him and knocked, fully aware of how improper the visit was. A white, unmarried professor calling on a colored woman and her child in a boarding house could raise serious questions if word reached the Institute's trustees. But curiosity had won over manners, that dangerous urge that drives scientists to look where they have been told not to. The woman who opened the door appeared to be about 35. Her face showed the wear of years of hard labor and constant worry. She wore a plain gray dress, carefully patched at the elbows, and her hair was wrapped in a faded blue cloth. When she saw Webb, fear flashed briefly across her face before she hid it behind the calm expression colored people learned to show white authority. "Ma'am, I'm Professor Harrison Webb from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. I'm looking for Mrs. Lydia Johnson." "I'm Lydia Johnson, sir." Her voice was quiet, waiting for bad news, because that was usually what visits from white men meant. "Is your daughter here, Miss Lydia Johnson?" Lydia's hand tightened on the doorframe. "What is this about? Is she in trouble?" "Sir, if she did something wrong at the Institute, I promise she won't go back. I told her to stay in the storage room while I clean, not to touch anything. But sometimes she wanders. Children get curious. It won't happen again. She's not in trouble, Mrs. Johnson, just the opposite. I need to speak with her about something she did." Those words seemed to drain the last bit of color from Clara's face. She stepped aside and opened the door wider, accepting whatever was coming. The room was small, maybe 12 feet square, with one window facing a brick wall. A narrow bed sat against one wall. A small table with 2 mismatched chairs stood in the center. In the corner, a pile of blankets on the floor showed where the child slept. The room was spotless. The poverty was severe but carried with dignity. A colored girl sat at the table, focused on something in her lap. She was small for 13. Thin in a way that suggested skipped meals so her mother could eat. Her skin was dark brown, her hair braided tightly to her head, her dress a faded calico that had been let out again and again as she grew. When she looked up at Webb, he noticed her eyes. They were wide, dark, and deeply unsettling. They looked at him and through him at the same time, as if measuring something he could not see. "Lydia, this is Professor Webb from MIT. He wants to speak with you." Clarara's voice carried a warning beneath the words. "Be polite, be small, do not give them a reason." "Good afternoon, sir," Lydia said softly. She stood and set aside what she had been holding, a piece of newspaper she had been studying. Webb stepped closer. The page showed an advertisement for farming equipment, but the margins were filled with tiny mathematical symbols and numbers written in pencil so small they were hard to read. "Miss Johnson, I want to ask you about something that happened last Tuesday night at the Institute. The foreman, Mr. Hicks, found you in one of our laboratories. Do you remember?" Lydia lowered her eyes. "Yes, sir. I'm sorry, sir. I know I shouldn't have been there." "What were you doing?" "I was looking at the blackboard, sir. The one with the bridge equations." "Why?" The question seemed to confuse her, as if the answer were obvious. "Because they were wrong, sir. The professors made a mistake in the third step, and everything after that was wrong because of it. It was like a building with a broken foundation. I could see it was going to fall." Webb felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold room. "You could see the mistake." "Yes, sir. Can you explain what was wrong?" Lydia glanced at her mother, asking permission with her eyes. Clarara nodded slightly, though she clearly did not know what her daughter was about to say. "The professors treated the wind force as if it came from one direction. But wind doesn't work that way. It twists and shifts, so you can't use a simple vector. You have to include rotation and change over time. I've watched wind move through the city. I've seen how it presses against buildings and bridges. It isn't simple. It's complicated." She spoke as if describing something visible, as if the math of wind and force could be seen by anyone who looked closely enough. Webb took out his notebook. "Miss Johnson, I'm going to write down some problems. I want you to look at them and tell me if you can solve them." Over the next 2 hours, in that freezing boarding house room, Harrison Webb carried out what would later be known as one of the most important intellectual examinations of the 19th century. He began with basic arithmetic that any educated child could answer. Lydia solved them instantly. He moved on to algebra, geometry, then trigonometry. She answered without hesitation, often giving solutions before he finished writing. Her methods were sometimes unusual, methods Webb had never seen, but her answers were always correct. Then he moved into higher mathematics, calculus, differential equations, and complex theory that troubled his graduate students. Lydia never slowed down. She would study a problem briefly, her eyes moving across the numbers as if seeing beyond the symbols, and then give the solution. Sometimes he asked her to explain how she saw it. When she did, she drew strange diagrams, visual shapes that were unfamiliar yet perfectly logical. "Where did you learn this?" Webb asked after she solved a fluid dynamics problem that had taken him 2 days to complete as a student. "I didn't learn it, sir. I just see it." "What do you mean you see it?" Lydia struggled to explain. "When I look at numbers, sir, I don't see what others see. I see shapes and patterns. Mathematics isn't symbols on paper for me. It's like architecture in my head. I can see how numbers fit, how forces balance, how systems work. When I look at an equation, I see the shape of what it describes. The bridge problem, I could see the bridge in my mind, see the forces on it, see how the math had to bend to match the real structure. Does that make sense?" It made no sense at all, and it made perfect, revolutionary sense. Webb had heard of savants, people with rare talents who could perform huge calculations but could not explain them. But Lydia was not that. She understood the ideas underneath. She could explain her thinking. She could apply it to new problems. This was not a trick of the mind. This was real, deep mathematical genius, the kind that appeared once in a generation, and it had appeared in a colored girl living in poverty, the daughter of a cleaning woman who had taught herself by watching the world. "How do you know about physics and engineering?" Webb asked. "By watching, sir. Mama cleans at MIT 5 nights a week. I go with her because she can't leave me here alone. It's not safe. I'm supposed to stay in the supply closet, but sometimes I walk around when the buildings are empty. I look at the blackboards. I read the books left open. I watch machines move, how bridges hold weight, and I see the math underneath. It's like the world is made of numbers and forces, and I can see the equations that make everything work. Clara had stood silently by the door, watching her daughter with fear and pride mixed together. Now she spoke, her voice tight. "Is something wrong with her, Professor? The other mothers say she's strange, that it isn't natural for a child to think like this." "I've been worried, sir, that something is wrong with her." Webb looked at the woman who had no education, who worked exhausting hours cleaning up after others, who was asking if her daughter's brilliance was an illness. "Mrs. Johnson, your daughter is not wrong in the head. She is extraordinary. She has abilities I have never seen in my entire career. She is solving problems trained mathematicians cannot solve. She understands ideas that take years of university study to learn, and she does it naturally, as if her mind works on a level the rest of us cannot reach." Clara's eyes filled with tears. "Is that good or bad, sir?" And there was the question, wasn't it? In a world that believed colored people were intellectually inferior, that used that supposed inferiority to justify segregation and disenfranchisement, that built its entire social hierarchy on the assumption that people like Clara and Lydia Johnson were fundamentally less capable than white people. What did it mean to discover a colored child whose abilities exceeded those of the most educated white men? Was that good or bad? "I don't know," Webb admitted, "but I need to understand it. I need to test her more extensively, document her abilities, try to understand how her mind works." "Will it help her?" Clara asked, cutting through all the scientific fascination to the only question that mattered to her mother. "Will whatever you do help my daughter have a better life?" Webb wanted to say yes. He wanted to promise that revealing Lydia's abilities would open doors, would prove to the world that intelligence had no color, would force society to acknowledge that its racial theories were lies. But he'd lived in this world long enough to know better. "I honestly don't know, Mrs. Johnson, but I can promise you this. I will do everything in my power to ensure that she's protected, that she's not exploited, that her abilities are used to help her, not to harm her." Clara looked at her daughter, at this child who saw the world in equations, who had been blessed or cursed with a mind that wouldn't stop calculating. "Lydia, baby, what do you want?" Lydia's answer was simple, devastating in its simplicity. "I want to learn, Mama. I want to understand more. The mathematics I can see, it's like I'm looking at a book with half the pages missing. I can see some of it, but there's so much more I know exists but can't see yet because I haven't learned the language for it. I want to know the rest." How could a mother deny her child that? How could anyone who claimed to care about knowledge and truth deny a mind like this the chance to develop? "All right," Clara said finally. "But Professor Webb, if this goes wrong, if they hurt her or use her or try to take her from me, I'll run. I'll take her and we'll disappear and you'll never find us. You understand?" "I understand." One Webb returned to MIT and immediately wrote to 3 colleagues whose judgment he trusted, asking them to come to Boston to verify what he'd found. Within 2 weeks, 3 of America's leading mathematicians had made the journey to that boarding house room. All 3 emerged shaken, convinced, unable to explain what they'd witnessed. Lydia Johnson could solve any mathematical problem they presented. She could visualize complex spatial relationships. She could understand abstract theoretical concepts that shouldn't be accessible to someone without formal training. And perhaps most remarkable, she could extend existing theories, suggesting new approaches and methods that, when the professors checked them later, proved to be valid innovations. She wasn't just mimicking or memorizing, she was creating, genuinely advancing mathematical thought. By February, word had begun to spread through academic circles, not publicly, not yet, but in the careful correspondence between scholars, the whispered conversations at conferences. "There's a colored girl in Boston. Webb found her. You have to see it to believe T." And with that spreading awareness came the inevitable question that would define everything that followed. What do we do with her? MIT's Board of Trustees met in emergency session on February 18, 1897. Professor Webb presented his findings, bringing with him documentation of Lydia's abilities, testimonials from the visiting mathematicians, and a proposal. The institute should provide Lydia with formal education, perhaps a special tutorial arrangement, since admitting a colored female student would be impossible given current policies. They should study her, yes, but gently, respectfully, in ways that would help her develop her abilities while protecting her from exploitation. The board's response was more complicated than Webb had anticipated. Half the trustees saw Lydia as a scientific opportunity, a chance to understand the origins of mathematical genius, potentially to prove that intelligence transcended race. The other half saw her as a problem. If word got out that a Negro child was intellectually superior to white graduates of MIT, it would challenge everything that justified the current social order. It would be ammunition for integrationists, for those radicals who wanted to overthrow segregation and force racial mixing. It would embarrass the institute, raise questions about their admissions policies, potentially alienate Southern donors and students. The compromise they reached satisfied no one. Lydia would be allowed to study at MIT, but only in complete secrecy. She would come at night when no students were present. She would work with select professors who understood the sensitivity of the situation. Under no circumstances would her existence be publical. Why acknowledged? She would be a ghost, a shadow, permitted to learn but forbidden to exist officially. Webb agreed because it was better than nothing. Clara agreed because her daughter would finally get the education she'd been desperate for. Lydia agreed because she didn't yet understand that being brilliant and colored and female in 1897 America meant that her mind would always be treated as either a threat to be suppressed or a curiosity to be studied, but never simply as a person with gifts to be nurtured. The arrangement began in March, 3 nights a week after Clara finished her cleaning work. Lydia would enter the mathematics building through a service entrance and make her way to a small classroom where Webb and occasionally other faculty members would wait. They would present her with problems, teach her formal mathematical language for concepts she already understood intuitively, and watch in awe as she absorbed years of education in weeks. She learned calculus in a month, differential equations in 2 weeks, theoretical physics in 6 weeks. She read Newton's Principia and found errors that had gone unnoticed for 2 centuries. She looked at emerging work on electromagnetism and suggested modifications to Maxwell's equations that predicted phenomena that wouldn't be experimentally verified for another decade. She was quite simply the most remarkable mathematical mind that any of them had ever encountered, and she was forbidden to exist. But secrets like this don't stay secret. By April, rumors had reached beyond academic circles. A reporter from the Boston Globe, following whispers about strange nighttime activities at MIT, began asking questions. Southern newspapers, always alert to anything that might challenge racial hierarchies, picked up the story in garbled form. Reports of Negro genius in the North, probably abolitionist propaganda, probably a hoax. Scientific journals began receiving letters demanding clarification, and in Virginia, a man named Dr. Marcus Thorne, who had built his career on chronometric research proving Negro intellectual inferiority, read about Lydia Johnson and became obsessed with disproving her existence. Thorne was 53 years old, a physician by training, a racial theorist by passion. He had published extensively on skull measurements, brain weights, facial angles, all the pseudoscientific apparatus that white supremacy had dressed in the clothes of objective research. His work was cited in legal decisions upholding segregation, in political speeches justifying disenfranchisement, in popular books explaining why racial hierarchy was natural and inevitable. And now this girl in Boston threatened to demolish everything he'd built. If a Negro child could demonstrate mathematical abilities superior to educated white men, then the fundamental premise of racial science that intelligence was biologically determined by race was false. Thorne couldn't allow that. He wrote to MIT's Board of Trustees demanding access to examine Lydia to verify her abilities to determine whether this was genuine genius or some elaborate trick. His letter carried an implicit threat. If MIT refused to allow proper scientific examination, Thorne would publicly claim they were perpetrating a fraud using a trained child to manufacture false evidence of Negro intelligence for political purposes. The board, trapped between Competing pressures made another compromise. They would allow a controlled examination by a panel of outside scientists, including Thorne, to verify Lydia's abilities and determine their significance. Webb argued against this. He'd read Thor's work. He knew the man's agenda, but the board overruled him. Better to allow the examination and let the truth speak for itself than to appear to be hiding something. The examination was scheduled for May 15, 1897, and Professor Harrison Webb, who had discovered Lydia Johnson and promised to protect her, could feel control of the situation slipping from his hands, could sense that something terrible was approaching, something he would be powerless to prevent, but he had no idea just how terrible it would become, or how far men would go to suppress a truth that threatened their entire worldview. And that is where we must pause. The examination room they chose was on MIT's third floor, a space normally used for advanced laboratory work, now cleared of equipment and arranged like a courtroom. A long table at one end seated the examination panel, Dr. Marcus Thorne from Virginia, Dr. Edmund Cartwright from Yale's Department of Psychology, Professor Lawrence Hamilton from Harvard's Medical School, and two representatives from MIT's own faculty. Professor Webb sat to the side, technically present as an observer, practically powerless. At the room's center stood a smaller desk, a single chair, and nothing else. This is where Lydia would sit, isolated, visible from all angles, subject to scrutiny from every direction. Lydia Johnson waited outside in the hallway, forbidden from entering. The board had decided that her presence might somehow influence the examination, as if a cleaning woman could secretly signal advanced mathematical solutions to her daughter. When Lydia entered, escorted by a stern-faced administrator, the 5 men at the table fell silent, studying her with the clinical detachment they might apply to an unusual specimen under glass. She wore her best dress, which was still worn and patched, her hair plaited so tightly it pulled at her scalp. She was 13 years old, barely 5 trillions tall, 70 at most, walking into a room full of white men who had the power to define her entire existence. Webb watched her face, looking for fear. But what he saw instead was that strange analytical expression she wore when confronting a mathematical problem, as if she was calculating the dimensions of the trap she'd walked into. "Sit down, girl," Thorne said, not bothering with her name. Lydia sat, her hands folded in her lap, her back straight despite the chair being slightly too large for her frame. Thorne opened a leather folder, withdrawing several pages of notes. "We are here to conduct a scientific examination of the claims made regarding your supposed intellectual abilities. You will answer our questions truthfully and completely. You will solve the problems we present. You will submit to physical examination if required. Do you understand?" "Yes, sir." "Let us begin with basic questions to establish your background. Can you read?" "Yes, sir." "Who taught you?" "I taught myself, sir, by looking at books and newspapers, matching the words to sounds I knew." "You expect us to believe you simply taught yourself to read with no instruction?" "I don't expect anything, sir. You asked me a question, and I answered it truthfully." The was something in her tone, not quite defiance, but an absence of the submission that Thorne expected from colored children. His jaw tightened slightly. "Can you write?" "Yes, sir." "Demonstrate." They provided her with paper and pen. Lydia wrote her name, then a sentence Thorne dictated. "The examination of racial characteristics requires objective scientific methodology." Her handwriting was careful, slightly cramped. The letters formed with precision, if not elegance. Thorne examined the paper, then passed it to his colleagues. "Adequate," he said dismissively, as if grudging even this minor acknowledgement. "Now we will proceed to mathematical assessment. Dr. Cartwright will present the first problem." Cartwright was younger than Thorne, perhaps 40, with the bland handsomeness of someone who had never encountered serious opposition to his views. He opened his own folder, selected a page, and read aloud. "A train leaves Boston, traveling west at 40 miles per hour. 2 hours later, a second train leaves Boston, traveling west at 60 miles per hour. How long will it take the second train to overtake the first?" It was a problem that any decent student of algebra could solve, the kind of question designed to establish baseline competence. Lydia answered before Cartwright finished reading. 3 hours, Cartwright blinked. You need to show your work. The first train travels for 2 hours before the second train starts covering 80 meters. The second train is 20 miles per hour faster, so it closes the gap at 20 miles per hour. 80 divided by 20 equals 4 hours of travel time for the second train. But you asked how long after the second train departs, so it's 3 hours. Cartwright checked his notes. That's correct, but you should write out the equations. If you want me to write them, I will, sir, but you asked for the answer, and I gave it to you. The examination continued for the next hour, progressing through increasingly difficult mathematics, algebra, geometry, trigonometry, calculus. Each time, Lydia would listen to the problem, sometimes ask for clarification of what exactly they wanted her to find, then provide the answer with minimal delay. The panel began glancing at each other, the kind of looks that pass between people who are witnessing something they can't quite process. Webb watched Thorne's expression shift from confident superiority to confusion to something darker. Anger, perhaps, or fear. Around the second hour, Thorne took over the questioning directly. These are parlor tricks, he announced. Memorization and training. The girl has been coached to perform these calculations. We need to test genuine understanding, not rote responses. He withdrew a different set of papers, problems he'd prepared specifically for this examination, complex theoretical questions that couldn't be solved through memorization, because they required real understanding of underlying principles. Here is a problem in advanced mechanics. A bridge span of 200 feet is supported by cables arranged in a parabolic curve. Given the following specifications for cable tension, deck weight, and load distribution, calculate the maximum safe load the bridge can support under sustained wind pressure of 30 meters an hour. He read out a series of specifications, numbers, and measurements that would take even a trained engineer time to organize and understand. Lydia listened, her eyes tracking slightly as if following invisible calculations in the air in front of her. Sir, I need to clarify something before I answer. What are you asking for? Theoretical maximum load based on the cable specifications alone, or practical maximum load, accounting for deck stress distribution and connection point failure risks. Thorne stared at her. Explain the difference. The cables themselves might be able to support a certain weight, but if that weight is distributed unevenly, or if the connection points where the cables attach to the deck aren't reinforced properly, the bridge will fail at a lower load than the cables alone could theoretically handle. Engineering isn't just about individual components, it's about how systems interact. So, which calculation do you want? The question demonstrated understanding that went beyond simple mathematics. This was systems thinking, the ability to see how multiple factors interacted, the kind of conceptual sophistication that separated competent engineers from brilliant ones. Both, Thorne said finally. Give me both calculations. Lydia closed her eyes for perhaps 30 seconds, her lips moving slightly as if speaking to herself. Then she opened them and began to recite numbers, explaining her methodology as she went, describing how she was visualizing the bridge structure, how she was accounting for force distribution, how she was calculating stress factors at critical points. She provided 2 numbers, one for theoretical maximum based on cable strength alone, another lower number for practical maximum accounting for system vulnerabilities. The panel sat in stunned silence. Finally, Hamilton from Harvard spoke up. Dr. Thorne, do you have the solutions to these problems? Of course. Are her answers correct? Thorne checked his notes, taking longer than necessary, clearly hoping to find an error. His face darkened as he compared Lydia's answers to his own calculations. The first answer is correct. The second answer uses a methodology I hadn't considered but appears to be valid. Appears to be. Webb couldn't stay silent any longer. Either the mathematics is sound or it isn't. The mathematics may be sound, but that doesn't prove she derived it independently. She could have been taught these specific problems. Then give her a problem she hasn't seen. Webb shot back. Give her something original, something you create right now that couldn't possibly have been anticipated. Thorne's expression suggested this was exactly what he wanted. He stood, moving to the blackboard mounted on one wall, and began writing. He spent 15 minutes constructing a problem, a complex scenario involving fluid dynamics, pressure calculations, and three-dimensional spatial reasoning. It was the kind of problem that would appear in an advanced physics examination, the kind that graduate students would spend an hour solving with access to reference books and calculation tools. When he finished, he turned to Lydia. "Solve this." She studied the board for several minutes, her head tilting slightly, that strange, unfocused gaze suggesting she was seeing something beyond the symbols written in chalk. Then she stood, walked to the board, and asked, "May I show my work here, sir? Please do." What followed was, for Webb, one of the most remarkable demonstrations of mathematical thinking he had ever witnessed. Lydia didn't just solve the problem, she restructured it, finding a more elegant approach than the one Thorne had anticipated, using visual representations that made complex relationships suddenly clear. She drew diagrams showing force vectors. She noted simplifying assumptions that could be made without sacrificing accuracy. She caught an error in Thorne's original setup where he'd accidentally used the wrong unit conversion, and she explained everything in simple language, teaching as she solved, making her thinking visible and comprehensible. When she finished, she set down the chalk and returned to her seat, leaving the board covered in her work. The room was silent except for the sound of breathing and the distant noise of the city outside. Professor Hamilton rose and approached the board, examining Lydia's work closely. He traced her logic, checked her calculations, studied her diagrams. Finally, he turned to face his colleagues. "Gentlemen, I don't know how to say this delicately, so I'll be blunt. This is legitimate genius. This isn't training or memorization or some kind of trick. This girl understands advanced mathematics at a level that I rarely see in doctoral candidates. She's not just solving problems, she's demonstrating genuine creative mathematical thinking." "Impossible," Thorne said flatly. "There must be some explanation, some technique she's using to create the illusion of understanding. What explanation do you propose?" Hamilton challenged. "That Professor Webb spent months training her to solve thousands of potential problems so she could perform on demand, that she somehow memorized approaches to problems she'd never seen. Be reasonable, Marcus. Sometimes the evidence forces us to revise our theories. My theories are based on decades of chronometric research, on measurements of thousands of specimens, on documented biological differences between the races. Then perhaps your theories are wrong." The words hung in the air like a declaration of war. Thorne's face flushed red, his hands gripping the edge of the table. "I will not have my life's work dismissed because of some anomaly. Science is about understanding the general rule, not being distracted by outliers." "She's not an outlier," Webb interjected. "Or rather, she is, but not in the way you think. She's an outlier in human cognition generally, not in Negro cognition specifically. What she proves is that the capacity for this kind of genius exists across racial lines, that our theories about fixed racial intellectual hierarchies are built on false premises. You want to overturn the entire scientific establishment based on one girl?" Thorne demanded. "I want to acknowledge the truth based on the evidence in front of us. Isn't that what science is supposed to be?" The examination continued for another 3 hours, but the battle lines had been drawn. Hamilton and Cartwright, though clearly unsettled by the implications, acknowledged that Lydia's abilities were genuine and extraordinary. The two MIT representatives hedged, suggesting more study was needed before drawing conclusions, and Thorne became increasingly hostile, his questions taking on an edge that moved from scientific inquiry toward interrogation. He demanded Lydia solve problems in her head without writing anything down, then accused her of using some kind of memory technique when she succeeded. He presented deliberately unsolvable problems with contradictory specifications, then accused her of being uncooperative when she pointed out the logical impossibilities. He began asking questions designed not to test her abilities, but to humiliate her, asking about her living conditions, her mother's work, whether she'd ever stolen books or sneaked into places she wasn't allowed. Sir, Lydia said finally, her voice still quiet but carrying a hint of steel underneath. Are you examining my mathematical abilities, or are you trying to prove I'm a bad person who doesn't deserve to have them? I'm trying to determine whether you understand the significance of what's being claimed about you. Do you realize that if we acknowledge your abilities as genuine, it would challenge fundamental theories about racial capacity? I know what you believe about people who look like me. Sir, I've heard it my whole life. I've been told I'm inferior, that my brain is smaller, that I'm suited only for manual labor. But mathematics doesn't care what you believe. 2 plus 2 equals 4. Whether a white man or a colored girl says it, the bridge equations don't change based on who's solving them. Truth exists independently of who's convenient for it to exist for. The room went dead silent. A 13-year-old Negro girl had just lectured a panel of white scientists about objective truth, and she'd done it with such simple logic that there was no immediate rebuttal. Thorne's face went through several shades of red. You're impertinent. I'm honest, sir. You asked me a question and I answered it. You need to learn your place. I thought my place was sitting in this chair solving whatever problems you gave me. That's what Professor Webb told me this examination was for. If you wanted me to be quiet and submissive, you should have said that was being tested too. Webb wanted to applaud and shout at her simultaneously. She was right, devastatingly right, but she was also a colored child speaking to white men with authority, and that was dangerous in ways that mathematics couldn't protect her from. Hamilton cleared his throat. Perhaps we should take a brief recess. This has been an intensive examination, and I think we all need to collect our thoughts before proceeding to physical measurements. Physical measurements. Webb's stomach dropped. He'd been dreading this part. Chronometry, the measurement of skull size and shape, was considered essential to any scientific examination of intelligence. In 1897, Thorne would want to measure Lydia's head, compare her skull dimensions to his charts and tables, try to find some physical explanation for her abilities that didn't threaten his theories about racial hierarchy. And there was no good outcome. If her skull measurements were unremarkable, Thorne would use that to argue her abilities must be fraudulent because genuine intelligence required certain physical characteristics. If her measurements were unusual, she'd become a specimen to be studied, poked, prodded, possibly even subjected to more invasive examinations. During the recess, Webb found Clara in the hallway. She stood when she saw him, her face tight with worry. How was she holding her own? She's brilliant, Clara. She's proving everything we knew about her abilities, but that's making it worse in some ways. What do you mean? Half the men in there are convinced she's extraordinary. The other half are terrified of what that means. And frightened men are dangerous. Clara grabbed his arm, her grip surprisingly strong. Gee, Professor Webb, if they try to hurt her, if they try to take her from me, you have to help us get away. I can't let them turn my baby into some kind of exhibit. It won't come to that. You can't promise that. You're a good man, Professor, I can tell, but you're one person and they're the whole world. If the whole world decides it needs to suppress what Lydia is, what can one good man do? It was the question that would haunt Webb for the rest of his life. When they reconvened, Thorne had regained his composure, though his eyes held something cold and calculating. We need to proceed to anthropometric measurements. Standard chronometric protocol. He withdrew a set of calipers from his bag, metal instruments designed to measure skull dimensions with precision. Miss Johnson, if you would stand and come here. Lydia looked at Webb, seeking some signal about whether this was safe. He had no signal to give her. She stood and approached Thorne, her small frame tense. This won't hurt, Thorne said, though his tone suggested he didn't particularly care whether it did. I'm going to measure various aspects of your skull structure. Hold still. He positioned the calipers against her head, measuring from different angles, calling out numbers that Cartwright recorded in a notebook. Maximum cranial length, cranial breadth, cranial height, facial measurements, angles, and proportions. The process took 20 minutes, during which Lydia stood perfectly still, her eyes fixed on some distant point, her jaw clenched. When Thorne finished, he studied his notes with an expression of deep frustration. The measurements are within normal ranges for her age and sex. Cranial capacity appears adequate, though. Of course, we cannot determine brain weight without dissection. The casual mention of dissection, as if Lydia were already a corpse to be studied, made Webb's blood run cold. That won't be necessary, he said sharply. We're examining a living child, not preparing a cadaver for autopsy. Obviously, we cannot dissect a living subject, Thorne replied with exaggerated patience. But it does limit our ability to draw definitive conclusions about the physical basis of her supposed abilities. There's nothing supposed about them. You've spent 5 hours watching her solve problems that most people couldn't solve with weeks of study. At what point does the evidence become sufficient? Evidence is meaningless without proper theoretical framework. Yes, the girl can perform mathematical operations. That's documented. But what does it mean? Is this genuine intelligence or some form of savant syndrome? An isolated ability divorced from general reasoning capacity? Is this a unique case or evidence of broader patterns we failed to observe? Can these abilities be reliably transmitted to offspring? Or are they a genetic anomaly? These are the questions that matter scientifically. Those questions all assume she's here to be studied like a lab specimen instead of educated like a human being with extraordinary gifts. She's a Negro, Thorne said flatly. Her education or lack thereof is not my concern. My concern is understanding the scientific implications of her case for our theories of racial intelligence. And there it was, stated plainly. Lydia wasn't a person to Thorne. She was data, a problem to be solved, an inconvenience to be explained away or absorbed into existing frameworks that kept the racial hierarchy intact. Hamilton spoke up, his tone careful. Dr. Thorne, I think we need to acknowledge that this examination has demonstrated genuine, extraordinary abilities. The question is what we do with that information. We study her further, Thorne said immediately. Comprehensive testing over an extended period, multiple examinations by different researchers, documentation of her development over time. This is too significant to be resolved in a single day. You want to turn her into a permanent research subject. Webb said, I want to pursue proper scientific investigation. Surely you understand that this case demands thorough study. What I understand is that you want to lock a 13-year-old girl in a laboratory and test her until you either explain away her abilities or she breaks under the pressure. Don't be dramatic. We're not discussing anything harmful, simple observation and testing. Simple observation that would require removing her from her home, separating her from her mother, making her entire existence about satisfying your scientific curiosity. The argument escalated, voices rising, the 5 men talking over each other, and in the middle of it all Lydia stood silently, listening to them debate her future, as if she weren't present, as if she had no say in what happened to her own life. Finally, she spoke, her voice cutting through the argument with unexpected force. Excuse me, sir. They fell silent, surprised that she'd spoken without being addressed. I have a question. This is not the time, Thorne began. When is the time, sir? You've been examining me for 7 hours. You've tested my mathematics, measured my head, discussed what it means that I can do what I can do, but nobody's asked me what I want. What you want is irrelevant, Thorne said. You're a minor, and more importantly, you're in no position to understand the scientific significance of your own case. I'm in no position, sir. I understand mathematics that you had to study for years to grasp. I can see patterns and relationships that took humanity thousands of years to discover. I taught myself to read and write because I knew I needed language to make sense of the mathematics in my head. I may be 13 and colored and female, but I'm not stupid about my own life. So, I'll ask again. Does anyone care what I want? Hamilton cleared his throat. What do you want, Miss Johnson? I want to learn. I want access to books and teachers and problems I haven't seen before. I want to understand all the mathematics I can see but don't have names for yet. I want to use what I can do to build things, to solve real problems, to make something that matters. I don't want to be locked in a room being measured and tested and studied like I'm some kind of animal that learned a trick. That's not what scientific research, Thorne started. That's exactly what it is, sir. You don't see me as a person, you see me as evidence for or against your theories, and I understand why. If I'm real, if I'm genuinely this intelligent, then everything you've written about racial inferiority is wrong. All those measurements you've done, all those conclusions you've published, all the laws and policies that rely on your research, it's all built on lies. That's why you're so angry. Not because you don't believe I can do what I've proven I can do, but because you can't afford to believe it. The silence that followed was absolute. A 13-year-old Negro girl had just articulated the unspoken heart of the matter with crystalline clarity, and no one in the room had a response ready. Thorne's face was purple now, his hands shaking slightly. When he spoke, his voice was dangerously quiet. "You have no idea what you're talking about. I understand more than you think, sir. I understand that you're scared. I understand that admitting I'm right means destroying your reputation. I understand that powerful men don't like being proved wrong by powerless girls. But I also understand mathematics. And mathematics teaches you that truth doesn't care about your feelings. Either my proof is correct or it isn't. Either my answers are right or they're wrong. You can't change the mathematics to make yourself more comfortable. You can only accept it or lie about it." Webb watched Thorne's expression and recognized the look of a man who had just decided something. This wasn't the face of someone admitting defeat. This was the face of someone planning how to eliminate a threat. "Gentlemen," Thorne said, his voice now perfectly controlled, "I move that we conclude this examination. We have sufficient data to write our preliminary reports. I suggest we reconvene in 1 month to discuss our findings and recommendations." It was a tactical retreat, a way to exit the situation without admitting anything. The panel agreed, everyone relieved to escape the tension. As they gathered their materials, Thorne approached Webb with a thin smile. "Professor Webb, I'm sure you understand that further security measures will be necessary. The girl's location needs to remain confidential while we complete our assessment." Security from what? From exploitation, from premature publicity, from those who might seek to use her for political purposes before we've established scientific consensus about what she represents. I'll be writing to MIT's board recommending that access to her be carefully restricted. It sounded reasonable. It sounded like protection. But Webb heard the real message. Thorne wanted to control access to Lydia to ensure that only researchers who shared his agenda could examine her to manage the narrative about what her abilities meant. When Webb left the examination room, he found Clara waiting with a desperation in her eyes that spoke of hours of helpless worry. "Is she all right?" "Physically, yes. But Clara, I need to talk to you about something. Not here. Somewhere private." They collected Lydia, who emerged from the examination room looking exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with physical tiredness. Webb led them to his office, locked the door, and told them what he feared was coming. Dr. Thorne is going to try to take control of this situation. He's going to argue that Lydia needs to be in a controlled research environment, that she's too significant to be left unsupervised. And I don't know if I can stop him. "Then we run," Clara said immediately. "We leave Boston tonight. Where would you go? Thorne has connections throughout the academic world. If he decides you're fugitives, he can have people looking for you in every city. So, what do you suggest?" Clara's voice was sharp with fear and anger. "That we just hand my daughter over to be studied like a bug under glass? No, I suggest we be strategic. We document everything. We build a coalition of researchers who acknowledge Lydia's abilities and oppose treating her as a specimen. We go public if we have to make enough noise that Thorne can't simply make her disappear. And if that doesn't work, then yes, you run and I'll help you. I'll give you money, contacts, whatever you need. But let's try the official path first. Sometimes institutions can be forced to do the right thing if you apply enough pressure from the right directions." It was an optimistic assessment, and Webb knew it. But what was the alternative? Tell a mother and daughter to flee into a world that had no place for them, that offered no protection for brilliant colored girls who challenged every assumption about who deserved to be called human? Lydia spoke for the first time since leaving the examination room. "Professor Webb, how long do we have before they try something?" "I don't know. Days, maybe a week at most." Then I need to learn as much as I can in that time. If they take me somewhere I can't study, if they lock me away, I want my mind to be as full as possible. I want to know enough that even if they silence me, I'll have the mathematics inside my head where they can't take it away. Can you teach me every day until whatever's going to happen happens? Webb looked at this child who had already grasped that her brilliance had made her a target, who understood that she was in a race to fill her mind before the world found a way to empty it. How could he say no? Yes, every day will work as long as you can focus. I'll teach you everything I know. And so began what Webb would later call the most intense educational experience of his career. For the next 12 days, he met with Lydia for 6 to 8 hours daily, teaching her advanced mathematics, physics, engineering principles, everything he could compress into the time they had. She absorbed it all with that same frightening capacity she'd demonstrated from the beginning, understanding in hours what should take months, making connections he'd never seen, asking questions that revealed depths he hadn't imagined. But underneath the intellectual excitement, they all felt the clock ticking, felt the weight of borrowed time, knew that somewhere Dr. Marcus Thorne was planning his next move. On May 28, 1897, that move came. Webb arrived at the boarding house to find it surrounded by police. Lydia Johnson was being restrained by 2 officers while she screamed for her daughter, and Lydia was being led into a closed carriage by men in dark coats, her hands bound, her face blank with shock. Webb ran forward, shouting, demanding to know what authority they had. One of the officers showed him papers signed by a judge declaring Lydia Johnson a ward of the state subject to immediate protective custody for her own welfare. The justification: her mother was deemed unfit to care for a child with special medical needs. Those needs being undefined but sufficient to warrant removal. It was all legal, all proper, all completely destroying everything Webb had promised to prevent. "Where are you taking her?" he demanded. "To a private medical facility where she can receive appropriate care," one of the men in dark coats replied. He had the bland efficiency of someone carrying out orders without questioning them. "She'll be evaluated by specialists, given proper treatment." "Kept safe? Safe from what?" Clara screamed. "I'm her mother. She's safe with me." "Ma'am, the state has determined that your daughter's condition requires professional supervision. Please don't make this more difficult." They loaded Lydia into the carriage. As the door closed, she looked back at Webb and her mother, and in her eyes Webb saw something that would haunt him forever. Not fear, not anger, but a terrible understanding that this was always how it was going to end. That brilliance and blackness, and being female in 1897 America, meant that someone would eventually decide you needed to be controlled, studied, or suppressed. The carriage pulled away. Clara collapsed, sobbing. Webb stood helpless, watching genius being kidnapped in broad daylight under color of law, and he knew with sick certainty that Dr. Marcus Thorne had found a way to get exactly what he wanted. Lydia Johnson would disappear into a medical facility where she could be studied in isolation, where no one would hear her voice or recognize her humanity, where her extraordinary mind would be treated as a specimen to be examined, explained, or explained away. But Webb was wrong about one thing. What Thorne planned for Lydia was far worse than simple isolation and study, and what would happen over the next 6 months would force Webb to make choices that would destroy his career, challenge his faith in institutions, and ultimately ask whether one brilliant child was worth burning down everything he'd built his life upon. The facility was called Brightwater Institute, a name deliberately chosen to suggest healing and hope rather than imprisonment and experimentation. It sat on 40 acres of isolated land in western Massachusetts, surrounded by stone walls and iron gates, accessible only by a single private road that wound through dense forest. From the outside, it looked almost pastoral, a large manor house converted to institutional use with manicured grounds and flowering gardens. But the windows on the upper floors had bars, the doors locked from the outside, and the screaming that sometimes carried across those carefully maintained lawns suggested that whatever happened inside Brightwater had nothing to do with healing. Professor Harrison Webb spent the first week after Lydia's abduction trying every official channel available to him. He appealed to MIT's Board of Trustees, arguing that the institute had a moral obligation to protect her. They expressed sympathy, but explained they had no legal standing to challenge a state custody order. He contacted lawyers, but none would take a case involving a Negro child removed from her mother by state authority. He wrote to newspaper editors, but none would publish stories that challenged the legitimacy of scientific research or suggested impropriety in judicial decisions. He even traveled to the courthouse that had issued the custody order, demanding to see the evidence that Lydia Johnson was an unfit mother. The clerk had smiled with bland bureaucratic indifference and explained that such records were sealed for the child's protection, every door closed, every avenue blocked. The system had been designed to prevent exactly the kind of intervention Webb was attempting to ensure that once authority decided something, that decision became unquestionable. Lydia Johnson fared even worse. She lost her job at MIT, the cleaning supervisor, explaining regretfully that a woman in her emotional state couldn't be trusted around valuable equipment. She spent what little money she had on a lawyer who took her payment, filed a motion to challenge the custody order, and then disappeared when the motion was denied. She haunted the streets near Brightwater Institute until local police warned her that continued trespassing would result in arrest. She was a colored woman whose child had been taken by the state. The machinery of law and social order had determined she had no rights that anyone was bound to respect, and there was nothing she could do about it except grieve and wait and hope. Webb's breakthrough came from an unexpected source. On June 10th, he received an anonymous letter delivered to his office at MIT. The envelope contained a single page written in a careful feminine hand. Professor Webb, I am a nurse at Brightwater Institute. I cannot tell you my name because I would lose my position and worse if discovered, but I must tell someone what is happening to the Negro girl they brought here 2 weeks ago. She is being held in isolation on the 3rd floor, East Wing. She receives no visitors. She is subjected to daily examinations that she does not consent to. Dr. Thorne visits 3 times per week and conducts tests that leave her distressed and withdrawn. She barely eats. She does not sleep well. I hear her crying at night when I pass her room. Yesterday I heard her speaking to herself, reciting what sounded like mathematical proofs over and over as if afraid she would forget them. This is not medical care, this is captivity. I do not know what they intend to do with her, but I know it is wrong. If you care about this child, you must find a way to remove her from this place before they break her completely. God forgive me for not doing more. A friend, Webb, read the letter 3 times, his hands shaking. So Lydia was alive, still conscious, still trying to hold on to herself through mathematics. But she was deteriorating. He had perhaps weeks, maybe only days, before the psychological pressure of isolation and forced examination destroyed the very mind that made her extraordinary. He needed help, and he needed it from someone willing to operate outside legal constraints. He found that help in an unexpected place. Marcus Webb, no relation to Harrison, was a former Pinkerton agent who had left the agency after developing a conscience about some of the strike-breaking work he'd been required to do. He now worked independently, taking cases that interested him, often on behalf of people who couldn't afford legitimate legal representation. Webb, the professor, found Webb, the investigator, through a network of abolitionist contacts who still operated in Boston, remnants of the old Underground Railroad, who had shifted their work from helping escaped slaves to helping freed people navigate a system designed to re-enslave them through different means. "You want me to surveil a private medical facility?" Marcus Webb said when Harrison Webb explained the situation. They sat in a dim tavern in Boston's North End, far from the university district where Harrison might be recognized. "That's the beginning. Eventually, I need you to help me extract a child from that facility. You're talking about kidnapping, I'm talking about rescue. She was kidnapped when they took her. What I'm proposing is liberation." Marcus studied him for a long moment. "You're a university professor, respected, established, presumably with something to lose. Why are you willing to risk all that for a colored girl you've known for a few months? Because she's the most brilliant person I've ever encountered, and they're destroying her because her existence is inconvenient to their theories. Because I promised her mother I'd protect her, and I failed. Because if we live in a world where genius can be imprisoned for being the wrong color, then all our talk about civilization and progress and human dignity is just decoration on top of barbarism. That's a good answer. Marcus pulled out a notebook. Tell me everything you know about Brightwater Institute, layout, staff, routines, security measures. Then tell me everything about the girl. What makes her so special that they're willing to go this far? Over the next hour, Harrison explained Lydia's abilities, the examination, Thorne's agenda, the legal maneuvering that had resulted in her capture. Marcus listened with the focused attention of someone who had spent years gathering intelligence, asking occasional questions, making notes in a personal short-torth hand. When Harrison finished, Marcus sat back, his expression grim. You understand that even if we get her out, it doesn't end there. They'll hunt for her. They'll charge you with abduction, interfering with a court order, probably a dozen other crimes. You'll lose your position, possibly face prison time. Your career will be destroyed. I know. And the girl and her mother, they'll have to disappear completely. New names, new city,